For 9 years, CIA analyst Thomas Marsh slept next to a woman who did not exist. He kissed a phantom. He raised 2 children with a ghost. He thought he was living the American dream in suburban Virginia, but he was actually living inside a Soviet intelligence operation. It did not end with a gunshot or a high-speed chase. It ended at a kitchen table with a yellow rubber duck and a secret code that would destroy his family forever. March 4th, 1986, 11:47 in the evening. A man named Thomas Alden Marsh sat at his kitchen table in a colonial-style house on Sycamore Glen Drive in McLean, Virginia, and read a bedtime story to a rubber duck. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. The duck belonged to his daughter Claire, who was 6 years old and had left it on the kitchen table beside her orange juice glass, which still had the wet ring of the morning on the wood. Thomas had been working late. He had missed dinner again. He had come home to a dark house, a quiet kitchen, and a yellow rubber duck staring up at him from beside a book he did not recognize. A small, thin paperback, bright blue cover. The kind of cheap, cheerful thing you find at the end of a pharmacy aisle. A children's story called The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. He had never seen it before. That was the first odd thing. Thomas Marsh was, by the professional habits of his trade, a man who noticed when something was out of place. He had spent 11 years as a Soviet affairs analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Intelligence, at the agency's headquarters in Langley, a 15-minute drive from the house on Sycamore Glen Drive. He read classified cable traffic for a living. He reconstructed the intentions of foreign governments from the fragments of intercepted language and behavioral signal. He was, by all accounts, by the accounts of his colleagues, his supervisors, the deputy director who once described him in a fitness report as possessing a genuinely uncommon clarity of analytical judgment, exceptionally good at his job. He was not, by any of those same accounts, exceptionally good at being a husband. His wife, Elena, would have agreed with that assessment. She was 34 years old in the spring of 1986. She was a woman of particular stillness, the kind of stillness that reads as contentment to people who do not look closely, and as discipline to the people who do. She had grown up, according to the biography she had given Thomas when they first met at a Georgetown faculty party in 1976, in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, the daughter of a Czech engineer and a Slovak school teacher, a family that had emigrated to the United States through West Germany in 1969 when Elena was 17. She spoke English with only the faintest trace of an accent, a slight flattening of certain vowels, a tendency to place emphasis a half beat behind the rhythm native speakers expected. Thomas had found it charming when they first met. He had found almost everything about her charming in those first years. She was asleep upstairs when he picked up the book. Their daughter Claire was asleep. Their son Daniel, who was 9, was asleep. The house was breathing with the quiet of a family at rest. Thomas turned the book over in his hands. The back cover had a blurb about a girl who tends a lighthouse on a rocky Atlantic coast while her father is away at sea. A story about waiting, about keeping a light burning. He opened it to the first page, and he began to read. He would later say, years later, in a deposition that runs to 230 pages in a sealed federal file, that he almost missed it entirely. That if he had not been an analyst, he would have missed it entirely. But he was an analyst, and there was something that snagged his attention the way a loose thread snags a sleeve. He could not have named it immediately. It was a feeling before it was a thought. A wrongness in the texture of the language. A slight arthritic stiffness in the prose that sat beneath the surface of the children's story, like a current beneath a still pond. He read the book again, cover to cover. 11 minutes. He had timed himself without thinking about it, another professional habit. He set it down. He poured himself a glass of water from the tap. He stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, at the dormant garden Elena kept, at the silhouette of the swing set he had assembled the previous April on a warm Saturday afternoon, while Daniel supervised and Claire handed him the wrong bolts with great enthusiasm. Then he picked up the book a third time. And this time he brought his reading glasses. There is a technique, one of the oldest techniques in the long, shadow-filled history of espionage tradecraft, called steganography, the hiding of a message inside an ordinary object. Not encryption, which conceals that a message exists at all, but concealment. The message is there, in plain sight, wearing the costume of something innocent. A column of numbers in an accounting ledger, a pattern of dots in a newspaper advertisement, a sequence of seemingly random capitalizations in a letter home from summer camp, or the first letter of every seventh word in a children's bedtime story. Thomas Marsh found the message at 11:59 in the evening. He found it using a yellow legal pad and a ballpoint pen, writing down each letter in a column with the neat, economical handwriting of a man who has filled thousands of legal pads over a professional lifetime. He found it the way you find a face in one of those puzzle pictures. First there is nothing, then there is suddenly, undeniably, irrevocably, a face. The message read, "Tulip is secure. Confirm receipt by window." He sat with it for a long time. Tulip. He knew that word. Not from any file he could name in that moment. The human brain does not work like a searchable database, no matter how much the popular imagination of intelligence work suggests otherwise. He knew it the way you know the face of someone you've seen before but cannot place. An operational code name, a ghost of a briefing, a flicker of a cable, something heard in a hallway, something filed away in the deep architecture of 11 years of reading other people's secrets. He sat at that kitchen table until 3 o'clock in the morning. The rubber duck sat across from him. The book lay open between them. Upstairs, his wife and his children were sleeping. He did not sleep. At 3:15, he put the book in the inside pocket of his overcoat, which was hanging on the hook by the back door. He washed his glass. He turned off the kitchen light. He climbed the stairs in the dark, as he had climbed them 1,000 times before, placing each foot with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not want to wake the house. He stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment, listening to Elena's breathing, that slow, oceanic rhythm of deep sleep. And then he went to the guest room and lay down on top of the covers with his clothes on and stared at the ceiling until morning. He thought about one thing in those hours before dawn, one thing only. If he was right, he had been sleeping beside an enemy intelligence officer for 9 years. If he was wrong, he was about to destroy his family on the basis of a children's book. He did not yet know which terrified him more. You are listening to The Red Files, the channel dedicated to the hidden archives of Cold War America. If the untold histories of the intelligence age compel you, the human costs, the institutional silences, the ordinary lives bent into extraordinary shapes by the machinery of geopolitics, subscribe now. There are more files waiting to be opened. To understand what Thomas Marsh did next, you have to understand what Thomas Marsh had. And what Thomas Marsh had, in the spring of 1986, was a life that looked, from the outside, so thoroughly and specifically American that it functioned almost as a kind of declaration. The house on Sycamore Glen Drive had been built in 1962, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, though no one in the real estate listing had thought to mention that particular coincidence. It had 4 bedrooms, a formal dining room that the family used on Thanksgiving and Easter, a kitchen with an island counter Elena had refinished in white formica, and a basement Thomas used as a workshop where he built birdhouses on weekends. There were 2 birdhouses in the backyard. They had never housed any birds. The family drove a 1983 Volvo station wagon, sand-colored, with a dent in the rear left panel from a parking garage in downtown Washington that Thomas had been meaning to fix for 2 years. The dent was still there in March of 1986. There was a Schwinn bicycle for each child leaning against the wall of the garage, Daniel's red, Claire's white with a wicker basket. There was a subscription to National Geographic. There was a golden retriever named Sargent, who slept at the foot of Claire's bed and smelled of wet leaves year-round. Elena had a part-time position teaching introductory Russian at George Mason University in Fairfax. She had taught there since 1980. She drove herself to the campus 3 days a week in a navy blue Honda Civic and was, by the reports of her students and her department colleagues, a quiet, precise, and effective teacher with a gift for making foreign grammar feel logical rather than arbitrary. Her colleague, Dr. Patricia Wells, would later describe her to federal investigators as warm in the way a person is warm when they have chosen to be warm, deliberate about it, somehow. You got the impression she decided to like you. Thomas had never quite parsed that quality in his wife. He had taken her warmth at face value, the way most people take the things they want to believe at face value. He had understood, in the general way that intelligence professionals understand things about the people who choose to partner with them, that Elena was a private person, that there were rooms inside her that he had never entered. He had put this down to temperament, to the residual reserve of someone raised in a culture of political caution, to the ordinary unknowability of another human being. He had not, in 9 years of marriage, considered the more precise and catastrophic explanation. He considered it now. On the morning of March 5th, Thomas Marsh did not go to work. He called his assistant at Langley and said he was running a fever. This was not entirely untrue. His hands, when he pressed his palms to his face in the bathroom mirror, were trembling slightly. His face had the specific gray cast of a man who has spent a night in the company of a very terrible idea. He waited until Elena had driven Claire to school and taken herself to George Mason. Then he waited an additional 40 minutes after the Honda Civic had backed out of the driveway, because he was an analyst, and analysts do not assume that the thing that appears to have left has actually left. At 9:45, he went to work. Not to Langley, to his own house. He started with her desk, in the small study off the master bedroom that Elena used for lesson planning. It was orderly in the way that professional spaces are orderly when the person using them is precise by habit and by nature. Folders, syllabi, a grade book, student papers marked with clean, even notations in blue ink, a Rolodex, a calendar, the large paper kind with the squares, from which he could reconstruct the movement of Elena's weeks with reasonable fidelity. He photographed each page of the calendar with the 35mm Minolta he kept in his work bag, a personal camera, not an agency-issued one. He was not ready to involve the agency. Not yet. Not until he was certain. He found nothing in the desk that alarmed him that first morning. He found nothing under the bed. He found nothing in the back of the linen closet behind the stack of winter quilts. He found nothing in the pockets of the winter coats hanging in the hall closet. He found nothing in the freezer, Behind the containers of frozen soup, Elena labeled in her precise handwriting, vegetable, October, chicken, November. What he found, and what he almost dismissed as nothing, was a library card from a branch he did not recognize. The card was from the Westover Hills branch of the Fairfax County Public Library. Thomas did not know this branch. Elena and the children used the McLean branch, 3 blocks from Claire's school. He had been to it himself, twice, to pick up books Daniel had placed on hold. The Westover Hills branch was 11 miles away. There was no geographical reason Elena would use it. He put the library card in his shirt pocket. That afternoon he drove to the Westover Hills branch. He parked the Volvo in the library's lot, between a pickup truck and a minivan with a faded soccer league sticker on the rear window. He went inside. The branch was a small building, low-ceilinged, smelling of paper and central heating, and the particular institutional cleanliness of public spaces. There were 3 people visible: an elderly man reading a newspaper in an armchair near the periodicals section, a young woman with a toddler in the picture books section, a librarian at the front desk. Thomas Marsh was a trim man in a gray wool overcoat, carrying a briefcase. He looked exactly like what he was, a government professional of middle age running an errand. He walked the stacks with the appearance of casual browsing, and he studied the geometry of the building, the sight lines, the exits, the positioning of the stacks relative to the windows, relative to the front desk, relative to the reading alcoves at the back. The reading alcoves were important. There were 3 of them, shallow recesses built into the back wall, each with a wooden bench and a shelf above it. Private, quiet, not visible from the front desk. In the second alcove, on the shelf above the bench, there were 4 books arranged with their spines facing inward, which is to say, their covers facing the wall. It is not remarkable for a book on a library shelf to be shelved backward. It happens by accident constantly. But 4 books, in a row, all facing backward, in a quiet alcove of a branch library that Elena Marsh used for no discernible reason. That was a texture again, that same stiffness beneath the surface. He did not touch the books. He memorized their positions. Second shelf, third alcove, leftmost books, 4 in sequence. He left the library. He sat in the Volvo for 12 minutes and wrote notes on his legal pad. Then he drove home, made dinner for his children, helped Daniel with a book report on the Lewis and Clark expedition, bathed Claire and Sargent simultaneously in a manner that soaked the bathroom floor, and read both children to sleep. He read The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter to Claire that night, at her request. She had retrieved it from wherever she kept her books, a crate at the foot of her bed, painted yellow, crowded with paperbacks and board books and 3 stuffed animals who apparently also required literacy. She held it up and said, "Daddy, you have not read this one yet." "No," Thomas said, "I have not." He read it slowly. He used the same voice he always used, the slightly theatrical, varying the cast of characters voice that made both children sleepy with pleasure, and he watched his daughter's eyes close, and he kept reading until her breathing deepened, and the book sat open in his lap, and the only sound in the room was Sargent snoring from the foot of the bed. He closed the book. He looked at the cover in the lamplight. The lighthouse on the blue cover, sending its beam across a dark and empty sea. A signal, he thought. That is what a lighthouse is. A signal from a fixed position to a moving one. A way of saying, I am here. I am still here. The light is still burning. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a long time. He was a methodical man. This is the thing you have to understand about the weeks that followed. He did not spiral. He did not confront. He did not telephone Langley and pull a clearance and run Tulip through the system in a panic at 2 in the morning. He was methodical, and he was thorough, and he did what he had been trained to do, which was to accumulate evidence until the weight of it exceeded any reasonable doubt, and to do so without alerting the subject that a collection operation was underway. The subject was his wife. He began keeping a log, a small black notebook, the kind sold at office supply stores, that he kept in the locked drawer of his filing cabinet in the workshop, behind a box of router bits he had never used. He recorded Elena's movements, her departures and returns, her phone calls. He listened carefully from the extension in the workshop when she called people he did not recognize. He noted the books she brought home, the errands she ran, the times she arrived home from George Mason later than he expected. He began to pull at threads at Langley, carefully, with the practiced nonchalance of an analyst following a professional curiosity. Tulip was an old code name. He confirmed this without raising flags, through a casual browse of pre-indexed operational files from the mid-1970s to which his clearance gave him routine access. Tulip had been an unresolved case, an asset referred to in KGB counterintelligence materials obtained by a CIA source in 1977, never fully identified, believed to be a long-term sleeper embedded in the Washington metropolitan area. The case had gone cold. The analyst who had owned it had retired in 1982. Thomas read the Tulip file 3 times in a carrel at the back of the Langley reading room on 3 separate afternoons over the course of 2 weeks. He requested no copies. He committed what he needed to memory, which was a thing he was very good at. The file described an individual recruited by Soviet intelligence, most likely the KGB's Department S, which handled illegal residents and sleeper agents, sometime in the early to mid-1970s. The individual was believed to be female, of Central or Eastern European origin, placed in an American academic or professional environment, with a long-term operational mandate that was primarily intelligence gathering rather than active sabotage. A listener, not an actor. A lighthouse keeper, not a sailor. Thomas Marsh sat with this for a very long time. He had met Elena in 1976 at a Georgetown faculty party. She had been introduced to him by a professor of Slavic languages who described her as a recent émigré, terrifically bright, working on her teaching credentials. She had spoken to Thomas for 45 minutes about Soviet economic policy and the structural contradictions of the Brezhnev doctrine, and he had thought, here is a woman worth knowing. He had not thought, here is a woman who knows too much to be who she says she is. He thought it now. This is the Red Files. Before we continue, pause for a moment. You are sitting where Thomas Marsh sat. The actual house, the actual children, 9 years of marriage surrounding you like water. The book is open on the table. You know what you know. What do you do? Leave a comment below. We read every one of them. April 1986. The Washington suburbs in that particular spring had a quality of aggressive normalcy that Thomas would later find, in retrospect, almost unbearable. The cherry blossoms were spectacular that year. The weather turned warm in early April and stayed warm, and the neighborhood on Sycamore Glen Drive had the bright, scrubbed look of a film set. Green lawns, children on bicycles, garage doors open on Saturday mornings, the sound of lawnmowers and basketball, and the particular percussive clatter of a barbecue grill being assembled for the first time since October. Thomas Marsh mowed his lawn. He attended Daniel's soccer game on a Saturday afternoon, standing on the sideline in a windbreaker, his hands in his pockets, watching his son chase a ball across a muddy field with the completely committed enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who does not yet understand that most things in life require a strategy. Elena stood beside Thomas on the sideline. She wore a red scarf. She cheered. She grabbed Thomas's arm when Daniel scored, which he did once, by accident, and then looked so thunderstruck by his own accomplishment that the opposing team's parents laughed and clapped. Thomas put his hand over Elena's hand on his arm and held it there for several seconds. He had not slept more than 4 hours in any single night for 6 weeks. At work, he maintained, an analyst's professional face is a skill distinct from his analytical skill. It is a mask, and Thomas wore it with the competence of a man who has practiced wearing it for 11 years. He read his cable traffic. He wrote his assessments. He attended his weekly team meeting and contributed 2 observations about Soviet military posture in Eastern Europe that his supervisor described as characteristically sharp. He had lunch in the cafeteria with his colleague Phil Darnell twice a week, as he always did, and they talked about the agency's organizational restructuring and the Redskins' off-season prospects, and never once in the entire duration of those lunches did Thomas Marsh say, "I think my wife is a KGB sleeper agent, and I have been living inside a Soviet intelligence operation for 9 years." What he did instead was go back to the Westover Hills Library. On the 14th of April, a Monday, he arrived at the library at 11 in the morning and positioned himself in the periodicals section with a copy of Foreign Affairs and a sightline to the third alcove. He waited. At 11:42, a man entered the library. 50s, medium build, gray overcoat. He walked directly and without hesitation to the third alcove, as a man walks to a place he has been before. He spent 4 minutes there. He left. Thomas did not follow him. Following was not his assignment. He was not a field officer. He was not trained in physical surveillance, and attempting to tail a professional under those conditions would have been both dangerous and amateurish. What he did instead was write down everything he observed about the man: the height, the build, the approximate age, the gait, the cut of the overcoat, of the shoes, black, plain-toed, thick-soled, the kind of shoe that is chosen for durability rather than style, Eastern European in its utilitarian aesthetic in a way that Thomas recognized from photographs and from the particular visual grammar of intelligence files. He went back to the library on the 17th, then the 21st, establishing a pattern. On the 21st, he arrived before the library opened and sat in his car in the parking lot and watched the building with the patience of a man who understands that surveillance is not about watching, it is about waiting, and about the disciplined suppression of the instinct to stop waiting. At 9:53, the gray overcoat man arrived. He was driving a dark green Chevrolet Caprice, 1984 model, with Virginia plates. Thomas memorized the plate number. Then he drove to Langley, ran the plate through a channel accessible to him as an analyst, and found that the car was registered to a company called Meridian Consulting Associates, with a Falls Church address that, when Thomas drove past it the following Saturday on the pretext of a hardware store run, turned out to be a mail forwarding service in a beige commercial strip. He sat with all of this for 3 more weeks. He returned to the reading room at Langley. He pulled tangential files, not Tulip, not again, but surrounding cases, institutional context, anything that mapped the operational geography he was trying to understand. He was building a mosaic, the way intelligence analysis always builds a mosaic, one tile at a time, the picture emerging from the accumulation of tiles rather than from any single revelatory shard. What the mosaic showed him, by the end of April, was this: Elena Marsh, born, he now believed, not in Bratislava, but somewhere in the Soviet Union or a Soviet bloc training facility, to parents who may or may not have been her biological parents, had been placed in Western Europe in the late 1960s, run through a legend-building process that would have taken years and required genuine investment of resources and planning, and inserted into the academic world of Washington, D.C. in the mid-1970s, with a long-term mandate to develop relationships with American government and intelligence personnel. She had, at some point in the operational timeline, married one. The Westover Hills Library was a dead-drop site. The backward books were either signals or containers, possibly both. The gray overcoat man was a handler, or a courier, or a cutout. The bedtime storybook, with its hidden message, had come through Claire, through his 6-year-old daughter, who had received it from a source Thomas had not yet identified, possibly a classmate's parent, possibly a stranger, possibly through the kind of low-risk insertion mechanism that operational security demands. Tulip was his wife. He had been the target of a Soviet intelligence operation since 1976. Possibly, he had been the target since before they met. He thought about the Georgetown faculty party, about the introduction from the Slavic languages professor, a man named Dr. Reinhard Holst, who had retired in 1983 and moved to Portland, Oregon, and whom Thomas suddenly and very urgently wanted to speak to. He thought about the 45-minute conversation about Soviet economic policy and the specific and calibrated intelligence of it, and the way Elena had known exactly which topics to raise and which angles to take to make him feel that he was speaking to an intellectual equal about the things he cared most about. He had thought it was serendipity. He now understood it was preparation. He thought about their first apartment in DuPont Circle, above a dry cleaners that left the smell of perchloroethylene in the stairwell. He thought about the early years of the marriage, the specific texture of their life together, the habits, the rituals, the arguments, the reconciliations, the ways they had built a shared language of glances and shorthand and small private jokes that accumulated over time into the architecture of a marriage. He thought about the night Daniel was born and the look on Elena's face, the absolute stripped-down, unguarded rawness of it, and he thought, was that real? Was any of it real? He could not answer that question. He understood, with the cold precision of a man who deals professionally in the reconstruction of truth from ambiguous evidence, that he might never be able to answer that question, that the question might be unanswerable by definition, that the line between Elena the intelligence asset and Elena the woman, if there was such a line, was not one he could locate from the outside. He thought about Daniel. He thought about Claire. He thought about what happened to the children of traitors. Not traitors. She was not an American traitor. She was a foreign intelligence officer, which was a different and arguably more coherent moral category. She owed no loyalty to the United States. She had simply deceived it. And him. And their children, who were American, who had been raised by a woman who had chosen, or been directed, to love them, to be their mother, to read them stories and braid Claire's hair and help Daniel with his book reports and make chicken soup. October, November, the dates written in her careful handwriting, as if the datings of soup containers were something to be preserved. He made his decision on the last day of April, 1986, a Thursday. He made it, oddly, in the hardware store he had been using as a cover for his Saturday driving, standing in front of a rack of paintbrushes, holding a medium bristle brush in his hand and staring at it with the blank intensity of a man whose mind has arrived somewhere his body has not yet caught up to. He put the paintbrush back. He went to the payphone in the hardware store parking lot and called his supervisor's direct line at Langley. He asked for a private meeting. No subject given. Urgent priority. His supervisor was a man named Gerald Cusack, 22 years in the agency, patient, careful, precise, a man Thomas respected in the specific and particular way that you respect someone who is very good at a very hard thing. Cusack called back within the hour. Thomas told him, in 3 careful sentences, that he had reason to believe he had information relevant to an unresolved counterintelligence matter, and that the information was personal in nature and required an immediate, secure conversation. Cusack was quiet for 4 seconds, and then he said, "Come in tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, my office." Thomas said, "All right." He drove home. He made dinner. He sat at the table with Elena and Daniel and Claire, and he ate the pasta Elena had made, penne with a tomato sauce from a jar. She was not, she had always cheerfully admitted, a particularly ambitious cook, and he listened to Daniel describe a dispute at school involving a stolen baseball card and a boy named Marcus, who Daniel was fairly certain was the culprit but could not prove, and he listened to Claire explain, in great and largely incomprehensible detail, the plot of a cartoon she had watched that afternoon, and he laughed at the right moments, and he poured Elena's wine without being asked, and she looked up and said thank you with that particular slight smile, the one that reached her eyes, and he said, "You're welcome," and he meant it, and he hated himself for meaning it. He was going to walk into Gerald Cusack's office the next morning and end his wife's life as she knew it. He was going to do it because he believed it was right, and because he had spent 20 years swearing to protect the security of the United States of America, and because he was, at his core, whatever else he was or was not, a man of that particular and unforgiving species of integrity that does not allow the private cost of a thing to determine whether the thing is done. He was also going to do it because he was afraid. Because if he did not report it, and it came to light, and these things came to light eventually, always, he would be destroyed. Not just professionally, in every sense. He did not like that second reason. It was true, but he did not like it. He had spent 20 years in an institution that ran on second reasons, on the alignment of principle with self-preservation. He knew the texture of it well enough to recognize it in himself. He lay awake that night until 4 in the morning. Elena slept beside him. She slept the way she always slept, deeply, quietly, on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek. He watched the ceiling. He listened to his house. At 4:15, he got up, went to the workshop, took the small black notebook from the locked drawer, and wrote one sentence on the last page. The sentence read, "The children must not know." May 1st, 1986, 7 o'clock in the morning. Gerald Cusack's office on the 4th floor of the headquarters building at Langley, Virginia. A room Thomas Marsh had been in perhaps 200 times over the course of his career. He sat in the chair across from Cusack's desk, the standard-issue government chair, institutional green fabric, the armrests worn smooth by 2 decades of nervous hands, and he put the small black notebook on the desk and the children's book beside it, and he placed the legal pad with his coded message reconstruction on top of the book, and then he sat back, and Gerald Cusack looked at him, and Thomas said, "I need you to hear me all the way through before you say anything." Cusack nodded. He was that kind of man. Thomas spoke for 41 minutes. He spoke precisely and without embellishment, the way he wrote his analytical assessments, laying the evidence in sequence, distinguishing between confirmed observations and inferences, noting explicitly where his methodology had been limited by the fact that he was conducting a personal investigation without agency resources and without counterintelligence training. He presented the library card, the dead drop location, the surveillance of the handler, the vehicle registration of Meridian Consulting Associates, the decoded message from the children's book, and his analysis of the correspondence between the tulip file and the biographical profile of his wife. When he finished, Cusack was quiet for 20 seconds. Then he said, "How long have you known?" 8 weeks, Thomas said. "Since the 4th of March. And she has no idea you know." "None." Cusack looked at the notebook. He looked at the children's book. He looked at Thomas Marsh, and his face had the controlled, careful expression of a man who is managing something difficult from behind a professional surface. And Thomas recognized this because he was doing the same thing from the other side of the desk. "You have children," Cusack said. "A son and a daughter," Thomas said. 9 and 6. Cusack picked up the legal pad with the decoded message. He read it for what Thomas estimated was considerably longer than it took to read 9 words. Then he put it down. "I'm going to need to bring in counterintelligence," he said. "I know. This will become a formal operation. You understand what that means?" "I know what it means." "It means you will be a witness, not a handler, not an analyst on the case, a witness. You will be interviewed repeatedly and extensively. You will surrender all of this material. You will have no operational role in what happens next." "I know," Thomas said again. Cusack stood up. He walked to his window, the window that looked north, across the tree line, toward nothing in particular. He stood there for a moment. "The children," he said. "Have you thought about what you're going to tell the children?" Thomas had thought about almost nothing else for 8 weeks. "I have something in mind," he said. What Thomas Marsh told his children over the weeks and months that followed the arrest of Elena Marsh on the 16th of May, 1986, in the parking lot of the George Mason University Faculty Building, was this. Their mother had been approached by the United States government for a secret assignment, a mission so important and so sensitive that she could tell no one about it, not even her family. The mission required her to go abroad. It required her to be away for a long time. It required her to be, for reasons the children were too young to understand but would one day come to appreciate, effectively invisible. She had agreed to do it because she was brave, and because she believed in it, and because she loved them very much. And sometimes love meant doing hard things that could not be explained. She could not write to them. She could not call. The nature of the mission did not permit it. But she thought about them every day. He knew this. He was certain of it. That is what Thomas Marsh told his children. He told them in the living room, on the cream-colored sofa Elena had chosen, with Sargent lying between Daniel and Claire, with his large golden head in Claire's lap. Daniel was 9 years old and looked at his father with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave and was not entirely succeeding. Claire was 6 years old and asked, after a long silence, whether her mother was going to send a postcard. Thomas said he did not think the mission permitted postcards. Claire nodded seriously. She seemed to accept this. Children, Thomas would reflect later, are better equipped than adults to accept a story that contains a clear emotional logic, even when the factual architecture of it is impossible. What Claire understood was, Mama is doing something important. Mama will not be here. This is sad, but it is a sad that has a reason. Daniel understood more. Daniel had the same quality of analytical attention that Thomas recognized in himself, the trait of noticing when the surface of a thing and the interior of a thing did not quite align. He asked, that night, after Claire was in bed, whether the government would tell them when the mission was over. Thomas said he hoped so. Daniel asked whether other kids' parents went on missions like this. Thomas said yes, sometimes, though it was very uncommon. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Will she remember us?" Thomas said, "She will never stop remembering you." This was the one thing he said that he believed completely. The cover story, the mission story, was managed with the same bureaucratic efficiency that the intelligence community brings to operational security matters, which is to say it was managed imperfectly, with good intentions and structural limitations, and it held together through a combination of institutional cooperation and the ordinary human tendency to believe things that are unbearable to disbelieve. The school was told that Elena had accepted a foreign teaching position. The neighbors were told the same. Dr. Patricia Wells at George Mason was told that Elena had taken a leave of absence for personal reasons, and if she suspected otherwise, and a woman of her particular perceptiveness likely did, she kept it to herself. Thomas's mother, who lived in Richmond and visited 4 times a year, was told that Elena had run into some difficulty and that Thomas was managing the situation. The exact nature of the difficulty was not specified, and Thomas's mother, who was a woman of considerable dignity and considerable wariness, did not ask for specification. The official federal record of Elena Marsh's arrest, prosecution, and conviction was classified. Her trial was not held in open court. She pleaded guilty to charges under the Espionage Act after a process of negotiation that ran through the summer and into the fall of 1986, and that Thomas was not a party to except as a cooperating witness. She was sentenced in November of 1986 in a closed proceeding. Thomas was not present. He could not have been present. He was told the sentence afterward by Gerald Cusack in the same office, in the same chair. He drove home. He got out of the Volvo in the driveway. He stood for a moment in the evening air, which was cold and clear, smelling of fallen leaves and wood smoke from someone's chimney up the street. The house had lights on in the kitchen and the front room. He could see the blue flicker of the television through the living room curtains. He went inside. He hung up his coat. He went to the kitchen, where Sargent was eating, and Daniel was doing homework at the kitchen table, and Claire was making what she called a tower out of stacked soup cans from the pantry, which she had apparently been doing for some time. The tower was impressive. It was 7 cans high. Thomas said, "How was school?" Daniel said, "Fine. I got a B+ on the Lewis and Clark thing." Claire said, "Daddy, watch," and added an 8th can to the tower with tremendous care. The tower held. Thomas sat down at the kitchen table and watched his children and did not say anything for a while. The lie was 20 years old when it began to die. Thomas Marsh had understood, from the night he wrote that sentence in the black notebook, the children must not know, that he was not simply creating a temporary shelter for his children. He was constructing a permanent architecture. Once you build a lie around a child's foundational understanding of who their mother is and what she meant and where she went, you cannot dismantle it piece by piece. The lie is load-bearing. Pull one wall, and the whole thing comes down. And the whole thing coming down, as Thomas understood it in 1986, when Daniel was 9 and Claire was 6, meant something too catastrophic to contemplate. It meant telling a 9-year-old boy that his mother had not gone on a brave and important mission, that she was not a secret hero, that she was, by the categories available to a 9-year-old, a villain, a spy for the other side, a woman who had come into their father's life by design rather than by accident, a woman whose love for them, real or performed or some unresolvable mixture of both, had been, from the institutional perspective, incidental. He could not give them that. Not then. So he gave them the mission. He maintained the mission across years and decades with the same methodical care he had applied to building the case against Elena. He kept the story internally consistent. He gave it details as the children grew older and the story needed to withstand more sophisticated interrogation. The mission was in Eastern Europe. He was vague on geography, precise on mood. It required Elena to remain completely isolated for operational security reasons. No contact whatsoever. The agency was monitoring her welfare. Thomas was kept informed through a back channel that he could not discuss in detail. She was alive, and she was well, and she thought about them every day. This was the architecture. Thomas maintained it for 2 decades. It was not without cost. The cost of a 20-year lie, paid out over 20 years, is not a single catastrophic expenditure. It is a daily tariff, a small, ongoing bleeding that the liar learns to manage the way a diabetic manages blood sugar, with a constant, low-grade vigilance that becomes so habitual it is indistinguishable from ordinary life. Thomas paid this tariff in sleep, in the quality of his attention to his children's questions, in the hypervigilance he maintained around any news coverage of Soviet espionage cases, in the careful monitoring of what Daniel and Claire might find if they looked, in the systematic prevention of any avenue by which they might look. He burned what could be burned. He locked what could be locked. He built around the classified record a civilian moat of misdirection that he maintained with the thoroughness of a professional and the desperate energy of a father. Daniel grew up. He went to Johns Hopkins, where he studied international relations, a choice his father regarded with the complicated pride of a man who understands exactly what it means and cannot say so. He was a serious, methodical student. He had his father's analytical habit. He was, by his 20s, a young man of considerable intelligence and a particular quality of emotional restraint that his college friends read as confidence and that Thomas recognized as the adaptive architecture of a child who had grown up with a wound that was never named. The absent mother had shaped Daniel in the way that absences always shape, not by filling the child with something, but by leaving a specific and calibrated hollow that the child spends years, sometimes a lifetime, constructing compensatory architecture around. Daniel rarely spoke about Elena. Thomas did not push. Claire grew up differently. She went to art school in Chicago. She became a painter, bold, large-scale work that her professors described as confrontational, interested in concealment and revelation, in surfaces that contained other surfaces. Thomas looked at her paintings and understood exactly what they were about and said nothing. Claire asked about her mother more than Daniel did. Into her late teens and then her early 20s, she would occasionally bring Elena into conversation with a sideways approach, a careful angle, the way you approach something very hot. She would ask whether the agency had been in contact recently, whether there was any news from the back channel, whether Thomas thought the mission might be wrapping up. Thomas said what he had always said, in the language he had always used. Eastern Europe was still complicated. The agency was still monitoring. Elena was well, as far as he knew. It might be a while yet. He had stopped asking himself whether what he was doing was right sometime around 1992. Not because he had resolved the question, but because the daily arithmetic of sustaining the lie had consumed the bandwidth that might otherwise have gone to moral interrogation. He was providing for his children. He was keeping them functional and intact. He was, he told himself in the small hours in the dark, protecting them from a truth that would have destroyed their ability to understand their own origin, their own lives, the specific gravity of a childhood structured around an absence that had been transformed, by his telling, into a kind of honor. Whether this was true, Thomas was no longer certain. Whether it had ever been true, he was increasingly uncertain. He retired from the CIA in 1998. He was 54 years old. He moved to a smaller house in Charlottesville, Virginia, with a garden. He grew tomatoes. He finished the birdhouses. He had been building birdhouses in the workshop on Sycamore Glen Drive for 20 years without ever installing them in the yard, because something in him had resisted it, could not quite produce the gesture of permanence. And in Charlottesville, he finally put up birdhouses, 3 of them, on cedar posts in the back garden, and by the following spring, all 3 were occupied. He visited Daniel in Baltimore and Claire in Chicago twice a year. They came to Charlottesville for Christmas. It was, by all external accounts, a functional family, a quiet life. A man who had done a hard thing and rebuilt a life around it. There was no drama. There was no crisis. There was just the long, steady, low-grade cost of the lie, paid out in a currency so familiar he had stopped noticing the denominations. He should have known, with the knowledge of a man who had spent a career understanding the fragility of constructed realities, that all lies have a shelf life. That the architecture of concealment, however well built, has load-bearing walls that cannot hold forever. That the world, the specific, searchable, indexed, digitized world of the 21st century, was becoming less and less hospitable to things that needed to remain hidden. He should have known. He did know. He simply could not find the mechanism to stop it. The Federal Bureau of Prisons Inmate Locator went online in 2004. It is a searchable database. You type a name. You receive a record. It is designed for the families of the incarcerated, for attorneys, for journalists, for the ordinary workings of a society that has decided that the location of a person in the federal prison system should be a matter of public record. It is thorough. It is accurate. It is, for the purposes of Thomas Marsh's 20-year construction project, catastrophic. Daniel Marsh was 30 years old in 2007. He was living in Baltimore, working as a policy analyst for a defense contracting firm, his father's son in occupation, if not in institutional affiliation. He had a girlfriend named Susan. He had a 1-bedroom apartment near Federal Hill with a view of the harbor. He was, by the accounts of the people who knew him, a stable and competent and quietly melancholic man who ran 5 miles every morning with the regularity of someone who has found that exhaustion is a more reliable mood manager than the alternatives. On a Tuesday evening in October of 2007, for reasons he has never fully explained, boredom, intuition, a thought he had been circling for years without landing on, Daniel Marsh typed his mother's name into the Federal Bureau of Prisons Inmate Locator. Elena Marsh, born 1951. The database had her birth year, her actual birth year, not the one in the legend. The database returned a record. Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, Connecticut. Convicted 1986. Sentence: Release date, or current status. Daniel sat at his desk in the apartment near Federal Hill and read the record. He read it again. He read it a third time. Then he called his sister. Claire was 27 and in her studio in Chicago, working late, when her phone rang. She would describe later, in the conversation with her father that proceeded by 3 weeks, the conversation with her father that ended things, the feeling of listening to Daniel read the prison record aloud over the phone as the feeling of a building you thought was solid turning out to be a stage set, like putting your hand through a wall. They did not call Thomas that night. They called each other back and forth for 4 hours. They reconstructed between them a childhood, the absence, the mission, the story, the details Thomas had given them over 20 years, the specific and calibrated weight of their father's tone when he spoke about Elena, the paintings Claire had made without understanding what she was painting about, the quality of Daniel's melancholy that had always felt to him like grief without an object, and which now had an object, a very precise object, a federal correctional institution in Danbury, Connecticut. They called Thomas the following morning. Thomas was in the garden in Charlottesville when his phone rang. He was kneeling beside the tomato plants, which were gone for the season, clearing the stakes. The morning was cold, with the particular bright cold of late October, and the birdhouses were empty, and the sky was the specific pale blue of a sky that has decided to be beautiful without any emotional investment in the fact. Daniel said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Thomas set down the stake he was holding. He sat back on his heels. He looked at the garden. "All right," he said. Daniel asked, and Thomas Marsh, after 21 years, told his son the truth. The conversation lasted 3 hours. It was, in Thomas's later characterization, the longest conversation of his life, which is saying something for a man who had spent 3 decades in the business of consequential conversations. He told Daniel everything. He told it in the order it had happened, with the same methodical precision he had brought to the original telling in Gerald Cusack's office, except that this telling had none of the professional equilibrium of that one. His voice broke once, in the middle, when he was explaining the night he had read the bedtime storybook, and he stopped speaking for nearly a minute, and Daniel waited in silence on the other end of the line, and then Thomas continued. When he finished, Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you love her?" Thomas said, "Yes." Daniel said, "Do you know if she loved us?" And Thomas said, and this, of all the things he said, is the thing he has said in every telling since, the sentence that appears in the deposition and in the record and in the conversations with Claire and in the conversation with the therapist he began seeing in 2008 and has continued seeing since. Thomas said, "I believe she did. I do not know how to prove it, but I believe it." Claire flew to Baltimore that weekend. The 3 of them spent a weekend together in Daniel's apartment. They did not talk only about this. They cooked, they watched television, they walked along the harbor in the cold. But they talked about it too, in pieces, in the way that you process a very large thing, not all at once, but in manageable increments, returning to it and leaving it, and returning again. They talked about Elena, about the specific question of her, whether she had been a prisoner of her assignment or a fully invested agent, whether the marriage had been ordered or had been at some point genuinely chosen, whether the children had been incidental or whether she had, somewhere in the long decade of raising them, passed through something real, whether there was a way to know, and whether knowing was necessary, and whether forgiveness was a thing they owed themselves, or owed her, or owed no one. These questions did not resolve over that weekend. They have not fully resolved since. They may not fully resolve. What the three of them decided, by the end of that weekend, was to write to Elena, at Danbury, a letter. They spent 2 hours on it, the three of them around Daniel's kitchen table, and it went through 7 drafts, and it was 2 paragraphs long, and it said, in essence, "We know. We are trying to understand. We are not ready to visit, but we wanted you to know that we know, and that we are here, and that we are," the word they settled on after considerable deliberation over the question of what word was accurate without being either false or cruel, "thinking of you." They sent it in November of 2007. Elena Marsh was released from federal custody in April of 2009, having served 23 years of a sentence that had been structured, through the plea negotiation of 1986, to include a substantial cooperation component that had provided the counterintelligence community with considerable material over the years. She was 68 years old at the time of her release. She was escorted from the facility in a car driven by a federal marshal and delivered to a halfway house in Northern Virginia, as per the terms of her supervised release. She was not, at the time of her release, expecting to hear from her children. She had not expected the letter in 2007, had not, in 2.5 decades, allowed herself to expect contact from the people she had, by the categories available to her, in the specific and unresolvable moral grammar of her situation, both loved and harmed. She was wrong about the contact. Claire met her first, in June of 2009, in a coffee shop in Alexandria, Virginia. Claire was 30 years old. She brought 3 of her paintings in a portfolio to show her mother, which is a gesture of such precise emotional intelligence. "Here is what I made. Here is what I was doing while you were gone. Here is the evidence of my interior life, that it requires no further gloss." Elena looked at the paintings for a long time. Then she looked at her daughter, who had her father's eyes and Elena's particular stillness. And she said something that Claire has not repeated publicly and has described only as, "the thing I needed to hear." And they sat in that coffee shop for 4 hours. Daniel met her 6 months later, in a different coffee shop in Baltimore on a cold December afternoon. Thomas has not met her. It is possible he will. It is possible he will not. He has said, in the one interview he has given on the subject, a long conversation with a journalist from The Atlantic in 2015, which he agreed to on the condition that the children's names not be used, that he does not know how to have that conversation, and that after a lifetime of professional certainty about very large and very consequential things, this specific uncertainty is the one he finds most intractable. He also said, in that interview, that he thinks about the kitchen table on the night of March 4th, 1986, the rubber duck, the blue book, the 11:47 on the clock, the moment before the mosaic assembled itself into a face. He said, "There are moments in a life that function as hinges. Everything on one side is one story. Everything on the other side is another story. That night was the hinge. And the strange thing, the thing I've spent 40 years trying to understand, is that I cannot say whether turning the hinge was the right thing to do. I can say it was the honest thing. I can say it was the necessary thing by the terms I had sworn to. But right, I do not know. I genuinely do not know. And I've come to believe that that uncertainty is the only honest place to stand." The birdhouses in the Charlottesville garden are still there. Thomas Marsh is 79 years old. He still grows tomatoes. He still reads foreign affairs. He has, in the garden, added a small bench near the birdhouses. A simple cedar bench, the kind a man with a workshop builds himself, sanded smooth, weatherproofed. He sits on it sometimes in the evenings, in the long, slow light of Virginia summers, and watches the birds come and go. He is not a man given to metaphor. He spent a career taking metaphors apart, in search of the operational intelligence underneath them. But even he, sitting on that bench in the evening light, with the small animals going about their unclassified lives in the houses he built for them, even he finds it difficult to avoid the image. A lighthouse keeper's job is to keep the light burning so that the ships do not wreck on the rocks. It is an act of preservation. It costs something. And the ships that pass safely by, in the dark, guided by the light, they never know who kept it burning for them. They never know what it cost. They only know they came through. And whether that is enough is a question each lighthouse keeper must eventually answer for themselves. Thomas Marsh is still working on his answer. This is The Red Files. If Thomas Marsh's choice resonates with you, if you believe at the end of this telling that a man in his position did what could be done and bore what had to be borne, leave a like. Not as a verdict, not as an absolution, just as an acknowledgement that some choices exist beyond the reach of clean moral resolution, and that the human beings who have to make them deserve to be seen in the full complexity of what they faced. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Because the Cold War is over, but the red files are full, and there are more stories waiting in the dark. Asterisk.